It's such a dynamic topic, the Arab Spring, because things are unfolding and changing all the time.
I thought that the panel was able to speak very authoritatively about the place of religion in the societies of these countries and what was going on.
We want the best research from people who are doing it right now and who are the experts in the field, and then them to be relating to public figures who are equally expert.
But it gives me great pleasure to begin by introducing Professor Linda Woodhead.
Just to say that we've got a very simple aim this evening, and that is to understand what is going on in the upheavals of the Arab Spring and the role of religion within the whole process. By the Arab Spring, or uprising, or awakening, or revolutions, all the terms are contested, we mean the series of protests and demonstrations across the Middle East and North Africa that began in late 2010 and that are still continuing. So we've seen rulers forced from power in Tunisia, Egypt twice, Libya and Yemen, civil uprisings in Bahrain and Syria, major protests in Algeria, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco and Sudan. One of the images that some people use is of the lid coming off a pressure cooker, a lid off the Cold War era politics and Arab nationalist regimes, and a massive outpouring of suppressed energies and identities, many of which are still in flux. And clearly, political and religious identities are in play here, very importantly, and often extremely hard to separate. So we're going to start off by asking the speakers to address the role that religion is playing in this, relative to other factors, and then we'll let the discussion flow freely along the other topics that arise. So I'm going to start with the two research experts, and first of all with Toby Matthiesen, whose name is Danish, but he's Swiss, is that right?
Yes.
He's at Pembroke College in Cambridge as a research fellow. For his doctorate, he has researched in Saudi Arabia and on Shia Islam there.
So I would basically argue that religious beliefs per se have nothing to do with the current sectarian conflicts we're seeing in the Middle East. And that is just the connection of religious identities and political struggles over political economy, over geopolitics, over transformations of authoritarian, centralized dictatorships who suddenly break up, and so identities become more fluent. I will just point out three major factors that led to the current politicization of sectarian identities in the Middle East. Now, the first one is, I would argue, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, because it really changed the way Shia Islam saw itself and was used by political groups across the region. And then, of course, the second major event was the Iraq War, and I probably can't really skip over the fact that some of us here were quite involved in this event, and I have to say, when we look at sectarian violence today, the Iraq War was probably, the major factor that led to this mess that we're in. And so the third event, obviously, are the events since 2011, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that in a bit. I think it is really quite important to remember who profits from these sectarian wars or a heightened language of sectarianism. So it's those people that profit from a divide and rule strategy, which was partly also devised in places like this to dominate other parts of the world. And rulers that came after the British and other colonial powers had learned how to do this. So fundamentally, this sectarian politics plays into the hands of ruling elites and of dictators and ruling families that want to stay in power by playing out one group against the other.
So now it's my pleasure to introduce one of my own colleagues from Lancaster University, Dr. Shahrukh Najib. Shuruq is a classical Islamic scholar, an expert on Islamic law and scriptures, but she's also an Egyptian Her family are still in Egypt. She has been actively travelling to and fro from the very start of the revolutions there.
With the rise of nation-state, I'm not going to give you a full historical account, but with the rise of the nation-state, which was a modern state, which prioritized not religious identity, but national identity, and this happened right after colonialism, when not enough discussions or not enough thought has been given to the role of religion in the new type of state and the place of religious identity in the post-Islamic empire. Most of these nation-states were modern states, established modern institutions, controlled education, controlled the making of the law. Most of the laws were secular. However, the nation-state recognized that religion still played an important role in Arab culture, in Muslim culture, in the Middle East, and in Egypt in particular. So the religious establishment became totally co-opted by the nation state. There were tensions, of course, but it was almost impossible to maintain independence of the religious establishment. This created a crisis of religious authority within the Sunni world, but particularly in Egypt. And within that situation, several religious movements arise to contest both the state and the monopoly of the religious establishment, which is now serving the nation state. One of these major movements is the movement of the Muslim Brothers. So the big question today is who speaks for Islam? Obviously, many Egyptians feel that the Muslim Brothers or the radical religious movements do not speak for Islam, but also recognize that there is a kind of moral bankruptcy in some of these religious establishments.
Thank you very much indeed, Shuruq. It's now my privilege to introduce the two respondees, as it were. And the first is Dr. Bassma Kodmani. She is a Syrian academic and former head of foreign relations and spokesperson of the Syrian National Council. She's executive director of the Arab Reform Initiative, which is a network of independent Arab research and policy institutes working to promote democracy in the Arab world.
The Arab Spring was a reaction to authoritarian rules based on civil values, on democratic values, such as citizenship, democratic governance, participation of civil society, human rights, of course. These were the principles that led people to go on the street. Injustice, social injustice, of course, and corruption as a key one. When these regimes are prospering and they are not threatened, they use security means to organize social connections. So society is based on vertical links to an authoritarian system that controls everything and prevents any of those what we call horizontal ties within civil society. So there are no established rules for communities in a society to connect other than through this awful authoritarian system. And the authoritarian system to which Dr. Shuruq just made co-opts the religious institutions. They are the best allies of these regimes because they are the players who help it control society, and we can call that perhaps soft security, although it's really not soft at all, and we are dealing with a very, very heavy legacy in this region where the authoritarian rulers have really planted mines inside the societies and have decided to blow them up the moment they are threatened. So this is what I think societies have been victims to a very large extent of this irresponsible behavior of authoritarian rulers.
Our final panellist is Jack Straw, a very old friend of mine, been a lone member of Parliament since 1979, nearly 35 years. We've worked together over many, many projects. He's held many offices of state. The one most relevant to the discussion this evening is his period as Foreign Secretary, where he played a very distinguished, though of course controversial role in many of the issues that we are discussing now. Jack, it's extremely good of you to come this evening. Thank you very much for doing so. And I should say, you yourself, in all your political life, have also been a man of faith and have thought about religion a lot. And I'll be very interested indeed to hear your reflections on this conversation.
Religious conflict, confessional conflict, is not confined to the Middle East, and certainly not confined to the early part of the 21st century. Just down Whitehall, one February morning, 23 years ago, an almost successful attempt was made to assassinate the whole of the British cabinet by the launch of a provisional IRA mortar, indeed proportionate to their populations. More people have been killed within the continent of Europe in the name of God in its different manifestations than even today are being killed in the Middle East. And we need to bear that in mind for two reasons, both to give us a sense of humility, but also to try to learn lessons as to how these conflicts take off and how they can be resolved. We have to see injected, in this case, into the idea of Islam, more sophisticated ideas of what it is to be democratic. There is a view, which I don't remotely share, that Islam and democracy cannot coexist. I don't accept that at all. What do we do about it? Well, first of all, I think we have to accept that just as the resolution of religious conflict in Europe took a long time, this is going to take a long time. Less time in the Middle East than in Europe, I think, thank God, but it will still take time.
I think we have to recognize that the issues, of course, the economic and other political factors are all important. The issues are also very theological, as you pointed out, and theoretical as well. For 200 years, the place of Islam in the modern nation state has not been resolved, and certainly the discourses of exclusion of many of these nation states have exacerbated the problem, leading to the radicalization of religious discourses at grassroots level, which is, of course, compounded by the bad economic situation of the majority of people in these countries, where the religious discourse or religion becomes a way to resist, but also to find solace, etc.
Almost every day I read an article in a newspaper that tries to explain the current conflicts by referring to what happened in the early days of Islam, or by, there was the schism was very early in Islam and so on, and now Damascus was a central place in Islamic history, and so now there's a new battle for Damascus going on. And I just, I think we really have to move beyond that, and so faith per se, believing in something, shouldn't be seen as a fundamental problem here. And I just think we have to make sure that we don't essentialize these conflicts too much. And that happens very often in the media.
I deliberately take the political approach and say there are political answers to many of our problems. And they can be resolved through politics. And I will take the example of Tunisia today, which has come up with a new government and a new constitution. And to do that, they did not address religion as such, because you cannot resolve the issue of Islam and the state. There's no answer to that. But there are other ways of approaching it. If you say all citizens are equal and have the same rights, you've said something that says the Muslim, the Christian, the Jewish, the Druze, the Shia, Sunni, whoever, are all in one category. If you say equal rights for men and women, you have taken away the whole discourse about Sharia should apply and therefore women should have less rights, etc.
One of the issues is we need to rethink the modern state in the Middle East. The nation state, as it has evolved, at the core of it is an idea of the military or the army as being the elite. It's not only about religion or democracy. It's about the nation state as having been militarized for 50 years.
Tunisia had other players who are not religious. It had very strong unions. It had professional unions and labor unions, which are across the country very powerful. It had political parties, and it had real civil society groups, including very strong and vocal women's groups.
Iran obviously has powerful and enduring links with Hezbollah in the Lebanon, but also is supporting not so much Assad himself, but the regime and the society around Assad. On the other side, you have obviously Saudi Arabia and Qatar, very rich countries, who have a different set of interests in Syria and are seeking, to put it as neutrally as possible, to develop and to expand those interests. And to some extent, these differences are labelled by reference to Shiism and Sunnism, but they also reflect very big power differences as well.
It is a bit too easy to say that, you know, we took centuries to sort out our sectarian differences, and now the Middle East will take a long time, and they've only just started. I mean, they had these conflicts for a long time, and the war in Syria is really fueling these things, and the West is supporting or has at least initially supported groups there, which also furthered this sectarian narrative. So, you know, the West is quite involved in these struggles. We're not sitting somewhere outside and, you know, let these people get on with it. We're very much involved in many of the countries where this is happening and partly responsible, and so we have to own that.
So the exclusion within national identities or discourses of national identities in the Arab world has created these rifts or fault lines in Muslim societies and Arab societies at large. And the constant exclusion is going to lead to radicalization by default.
I think one point and that Bassma made is important, that there is a problem of religious authority, a certain crisis of religious authority in Islam, I think. And it's partly to do with social media and the internet and YouTube and so on. And some of the hate speech that fuels these sectarian Sunni-Shia conflicts spreads on the internet and so on. And these days, it's much easier for a mid-ranking cleric of either religion to say things and then become very famous on YouTube and undermine many of the ecumenical efforts made by more senior figures, for example.
Everybody's quoting God. But the problem is, of course, this has led to, you know, the cacophony of voices citing or quoting God has led to many being skeptical. Okay, who's speaking for God here? Who has the authority or whose interpretation is authoritative enough to be followed?
There's a crisis of religious leadership and authority everywhere in the world at the moment. It's not peculiar to Islam. All the world's religions are in a major period of upheaval and transition because traditional leaders whose authority is based on traditional positions or bureaucratic positions are being increasingly challenged for just the reasons that Toby said by increasingly educated, literate, affluent populations with access to religious knowledge and theological sophistication. And so charismatic religious figures become increasingly important, and new forms of religious organisation in which ordinary people have a much more voice and choice. And that's happening everywhere. I mean, Jack mentioned the Church of England. The Church of England is absolutely subject to these same things. Leaders who aren't speaking, whose views don't represent ordinary people, hemorrhaging of support amongst young people, no respect for traditional leadership, and small fundamentalist groups very opposed to equality trying to take over. And the state, even in this country, not really knowing how to play this new situation, and a really radical rethinking of how states and religion relate, for example, in the sphere of education, is really overdue everywhere. It's not just an Islamic problem.
My primary concern is to do with Tunisia. Tunisia actually, the Islamists in Tunisia, I think, decided that actually their livelihood depended on tourism. And you can't have Sharia-compliant tourism in Tunisia.
I just want to actually, it's not a question, it's an observation about the issue of sectarians in the Middle East. The issue now is not just a Shia and Sunni. The issue now is us or terrorism. Either you be with us or you be with terrorists.
How much of this extremism and acceptance of it has to do with oil interests.
Is oil important? Yes, of course it's important. And the natural resources available in most, not all of these countries, but in most of the hydrocarbon resources are an important factor in their politics. And as we've heard, amongst other things, they provided a lot of the money, say, for the Saudis, to proselytize their particular view of Islam through the 80s and 90s.
I'm curious about how the panel might make an observation about the generational influence. It does look like those revolutions or springs were led largely by young people, and the backlash seems to be led by the old establishment. Are we seeing a massive generational change that maybe will, in the end, just die out naturally?
I think one of the key challenges for the coming period is how youth from across the spectrum, liberal, Islamist, etc., are going to organize themselves. They are, I think, very much receptive to the principles of human rights, citizenship, and participation, much more than the old elites. And that is true of the liberals as much as the Islamists. No difference there at all.
What would unify the people is a realization of the necessity of pluralism in the Middle East, which has been, created out of the Ottoman Empire with so many ethnicities, so many sects, so many religions.
Ethnic nationalism and religious nationalism, isn't a really good idea anywhere, because per se it defines itself against another, and in such a pluralist region with so many differences, always part of this other will be inside the boundaries of your state. So per se, something bad is going to happen.
Is there any evidence that the young are becoming disillusioned with religion, and if authoritarian rules are successfully tackled, will the next challenge be against religion?
With regard to youth rising against religion, I think within the Middle East there is generally a recognition that religion is part of the texture of culture, of language. Even Christian Copts, for example, would use phrases which are Islamic and Arabic. So religion or faith or religious language and identity are part of the substratum of the Arab culture. Its role in politics is something else. But there are very few people who speak against, especially amongst the youth, who speak against religion altogether.
So there's conceptual confusion today in all of the societies in the region. Secularism is a dirty word. And it's, of course, the most important principle to which we need to hold, because a lot of these young Muslims are practicing Muslims, and yet they don't want politics they don't want Islam in politics necessarily. So we have to resolve this conceptual confusion that has been introduced by a religious establishment and with a lot of financial means behind it.
My question is about the educational knowledge of the elites in these countries, the military elite, the religious elite, the intellectual, political elites. How much knowledge do these people really have about European history and how Europe tore itself apart over the interaction of religion and the state until it learned how to organize itself with liberalism?
These nations have got to make a similar resolution to that which European nations have done between their secular nationhood and the ability of their citizens within the space of nationhood to celebrate their own faith without that becoming a dominant factor in their politics. Tricky, but it has been done before here.
Also, we shouldn't forget that the Arab Spring, was a moment of hope, even though we don't call it spring anymore now. But I think the fundamental demands that were initially, pushed by these civil and youth protest movements, shouldn't be forgotten.